I'm your host, Tess Brigham. Let's start cleaning up this Gen mess. So today I'm thrilled to welcome Susan Schwartz to the Gen Mess with Tess. If you've ever wondered why some people handle stress like pros, navigate social situations effortlessly, or just seem incredibly self-aware, the answer lies in emotional intelligence, or EQ. But EQ isn't about being overly emotional or shutting down feelings. It's about choosing how to respond in any situation. Today, we're diving into the power of EQ and how it impacts leadership, teamwork, and generational dynamics in the workplace. Our guest, Susan Schwartz, is an expert in helping technical professionals and teams develop the leadership skills they need to thrive. She believes EQ is not just a trait, it's an action verb that empowers people to communicate effectively, manage challenges, and succeed in their roles. Welcome, Susan. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Tess. I am thrilled to be here. That's a good start.
So I know you have a rich background and you've done many, many different things, but tell me, give the listeners a little bit of an idea about you, your journey, how you got to where you are today, and how you got to emotional intelligence.
Well, and thank you. And that's key. I mean, I'll try to do the fast forward. The issue is I was the technical person who did not reflect and pay attention to my emotional intelligence. I thought that if you were the sharpest crayon in the box, you would be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked at AT&T designing integrated voice and data systems. I went from there to a small startup where I went from the world's largest company at that time to the world's smallest. I was employee number 12.
Wow.
And I helped the company go public. And it was a technology training company. And as I worked through the leadership and was part of the team that really led them to get to that public IPO status, I had to start paying attention to the people and support them.
Mm-hmm.
I still believed that technology was key. I always felt lesser than those really smart technical folks. Then I got to a global company, and it was an international software, and I was trying to get 20 different business organizations across 10 countries to come together and create a unified blended learning solution.
Okay.
And at that point, you do it one step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I realized that people made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Technology drove business. Back it up. I thought technology drove business. It's the people who do.
Yeah.
And when I realized that people were much, much more important in a business success than technology, I shifted over to project management and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered emotional intelligence when I was working with a project management professional curriculum. It's one of those 4-hour exams you only want to take once.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that curriculum, I worked with the management and leadership. And we would list all the leaders on the board that people could think of. And then we'd step back and we'd say, well, what do they have in common? What made them great leaders? And one person in every group would say, Susan, I can't tell you what makes a good leader, but I know one when I see one.
Mm-hmm. And
I realized that leadership is really intangible. It's hard to touch. It's hard to feel. I mean, how do you measure humility? How do you measure confidence?
Yeah.
And that's when I discovered this EQI 2.0 model. Mm-hmm. It has 5 basic levels, and it really measures 15 traits. You get 15 data points. Mm-hmm. It comes back to you in color-coded bar charts. So you can see the data, and you can touch it, and you can feel it. And over the last few years, I've started developing a way to interpret that data so that, I really appreciate you saying emotional intelligence is an action verb. Mm-hmm. And it's all about the choices that you make, because you can't choose how anybody else behaves except yourself.
Yeah.
I just talked with a client who said, if they would just do what I told them, they'll be successful. Yeah, I didn't laugh out loud like that. And all I thought inside my head was, I'm so glad you're going to hire me. So, it's really when we talk about being self-aware, and really the first level is self-perception. And it's not just how you see yourself, but it's really important that you realize how other people see you.
Yes.
And I always like to say, when you're in a meeting, are you thinking about what you need to get out of the meeting? Or are you thinking about what the other person needs to get out of the meeting?
Mm-hmm.
And the minute you start thinking about the other person, then you can start to create a win-win situation.
Yeah.
So that you both can leave the meeting. It's not a fight. You're not competitive. It's coming together to be collaborative.
Yeah, because EQ, emotional intelligence, like as you said, there's five core components, and then there's 15. It's huge. I'm sure you've had people say, "Can you just talk a little bit about emotional intelligence?" It's like, I can't, because it's huge. The first component is self-awareness. And I often say to people exactly what you're talking about, which is self-awareness isn't just about you being self-aware of what's in your thoughts. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? What are you doing? But it's also what's the impact that you have when you walk into the room? Mm-hmm. Are you bringing all of your crapola from wherever you were beforehand and walking into the meeting and dumping that out on people? And I think that that's important as well. We get so focused on right? Do you like me? Do you not like me? What do you think about me? Or, everyone's thinking about me all the time. It's like, no one's thinking about you as much as you are thinking about you. But we don't think enough about what our responsibility is as a human being of how am I going to show up? And I know you've been married for a long time. And so, this, right? Being married, this is a big thing, which is how do I walk into the door? And that attitude is going to affect your husband and or vice versa. And it's a little bit of part of your responsibility of being a good partner is, okay, I need to let these things go, or I need to tell my partner, hey, do you have 20 minutes so I can vent, or whatever that is, versus just bringing everything with you all the time.
That is a really great point. And a lot of emotional intelligence and being emotionally intelligent is a matter of framing and know who you're speaking with and what the situation is, so you can frame how you send your message. So that if you have a really demanding boss, and I had one where I love to get every single opportunity. I want them to know all my analysis. She was very direct. She wanted to have two choices, and she wanted a cover sheet. Now, if she didn't like the two choices, then I had all this backup stuff. But she really only wanted two choices. And once I figured that out, my life was really much easier. See, that's a challenge for many people in the workplace, because people say, well, this is how I communicate, so you should adapt to me. And you're not going to be successful if you're going to be passive.
Yes.
You get passive aggressive, and we all know those are not nice words. But if you look at it and you think about it as almost a bias, so, I like to communicate in a certain way, but I'm working with my boss who is very direct. I'm going to frame my conversation a little bit differently. When I have people who are working for me as direct reports, and I need them to understand what's going on, and, when you're aligning that strategic mission, how you speak about that strategic mission to your boss may be different than how you use the words you use with your direct reports. It's the same exact message, but you're speaking to somebody different, so you're going to choose different words. And what's really important are your peers, the people who you beg, borrow, and steal resources from. And as you get promoted, you really need to work with people across the aisles in different departments, because you're all working towards the same goal. So
Yeah.
again, you need to remind them that you're all going to the same goal. And if you understand something that they may need from you, and you know what you need from them, you work out a win-win. So when
Yeah.
you go into these, if you have a frame of let's create a solution that gets us to our goal, as opposed to being competitive. I need this and I'm not going to budge.
Yeah. Well, this leads in perfectly because here at the Gen Mess with Tess, we talk about the generations and how to clean up the Gen Mess. And what you're speaking to is something that I hear all the time from my clients. And it's when I talk about the generations, when I give talks, this is the biggest pushback that I get is from older workers who felt like, well, when I went into the workforce, I didn't get like I just had to adapt to my boss, and they were a tyrant, or they were lazy, or they were this, or they were that, and I had to just sink or swim. And for a long, long time, that seems to be this mentality that we have in our culture of, yeah, work is you just dive in, and if you can make it, great, survival of the fittest. If you can't, well, then forget you. And what we're seeing with the younger generations is they're coming in with different expectations. They're coming in with this belief that, well, hold on a second, I'm new here. I just got here. So I'm supposed to adapt to you. I'm supposed to make all these changes for you. And then how do I do that? And so I would love to hear a bit about what are you seeing when you're working, because I can imagine you're working with leaders of all different ages, um, as well as what do you think? Do you feel like, because this seems to be something that a lot of people are struggling with, which is whose responsibility is it when someone, is it the young person who's starting, and do you need to adapt to the company, or does the company or leadership need to adapt to the new hire?
Well, I'm going to say both.
Okay.
And, things really don't necessarily change that much. We've talked about it. I started working a very long time ago when we still wore stockings and high heeled
Mm-hmm.
shoes and, the bow ties and navy blue suits. And you
Mm-hmm.
went to work every day dressed like you wanted to be the executive president. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what we wore. Today, our executive VPs don't wear that. So we wear other clothes. But there were people, a lot of the Gen Zers are accused of being and feeling entitled.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you have to come to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all those many years ago, I worked with two young women who were incredibly entitled.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I see a lot of that same issues. And, I also see many Gen Z people who are incredibly hard workers. They
Mm-hmm.
get in there and roll up their sleeves and want to do their best. So I really don't necessarily like that whole generational effect because I've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
The extremes happen, but they happened 40 plus years ago and they're happening now.
Yeah.
But what's really important from the manager's perspective is when you have a 21-year-old worker who's brand new, you've never worked in an office before. And we all learned how to work in the office from what we saw in the movies or on television,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we all know that that is absolutely the way that office work is, right?
Yeah.
So I really believe that the the reporting person needs to be open.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be open to listening and learning. I also think that it's the manager's responsibility to look at how to engage people
Mm-hmm.
and to meet their staff where they are. And there are going to be some people where it's just not a good fit.
Yeah.
There are some people who need a little bit of confidence. Maybe they need to be paired with a more senior worker, and
Mm-hmm.
that pairing doesn't work out. They might need to be paired with somebody else. But it's that first line manager's job to kind of be a coach or a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to cater to that new person, but it's the manager's job to make sure their team is successful. And I think that when you have those managers who say, suck it up, I did that. And the reason I'm laughing is I just had somebody tell me that. I said, well, what would you tell a new person, a newly hired manager? And this woman literally said, suck it up. And that's like when we talk about 1990 office, but there are people in the 21st century who feel that way. So when you're a really smart technical person, really, really smart, you are the sharpest crayon in the box. And your performance reviews are all based on how smart you are. And it's not derogatory, but you're very egocentric because your paycheck depends on how much you learn. When you get promoted to management, all of a sudden your paycheck, your performance review is based on how smart your team is. You have to depend on other people performing well. And that's really scary. And that's when people micromanage. They don't delegate very well because nobody does it as fast or as well as they do. And, I've had several clients that have said, well, they need to think like I do. If they would just think like I would, they would be able to do the work. Well, we talked about reframing because not everybody has his background. Not everybody, thinks like he does. And so, you need to step back and think about how you're going to frame your questions or think about how do you set your expectations. And most importantly, how do you get that feedback to make sure that they heard your message and they heard your request like as you intended that to be. Because how often and I say it all the time, that's not what I meant. You didn't.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I meant.
Yes.
Because in your head, you're saying what you think is the right message, but they're hearing it differently. So it's both people. When you're telling, your manager or somebody else, and they push back on you, they could be pushing back because they didn't understand you. They could be pushing back because they weren't listening to you.
Yeah.
But you just need to, it's both parties. Communication is both ways.
Yeah. Which is very much what I when I work with my young adult clients, it's very much what I tell them too. I said, listen, you also have a responsibility too. You're starting this job and you can't pick your boss per se always. And you have to work with who they are and do the best that you can. I'm curious because from what I've seen, I feel like these younger generations, starting with millennials and now Gen Z, I feel like they have a lot more emotional intelligence than I did at their age. And for various reasons, I think part of it is there's so much information out there. There's so much, people like myself who go on TikTok and talk about issues and so on. So there's so much of that. But I'm curious on your end, what do you see? Does it seem like that as when you're working with relatively young leaders, are they a bit more emotionally intelligent?
Well, I will say it depends.
So diplomatic.
Well,
but you're right. It is. It does depend on the person always,
Well, and I have seen, and I think because we're getting a broader mindset. So when we were coming up, we all aspired to be those type A driver leaders, and they tended to be in the vertical, very top down, just very structured. You didn't go around your manager. And so I think we just pushed our emotions aside when Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, came out. I was in my technology phase. And I was like, feelings don't belong in the workplace. And I worked a very male-dominated world. And I was like, you just hoped you got to the bathroom, to the ladies' room before you burst into tears.
Yeah.
So what I see is today with the millennials and the Gen Z is we're moving into like a type B. We're looking at leaders where we're aspiring to collaboration. So I think the workplace is changing because our mindset of our leaders are changing.
Oh, I love that.
So, and that's those collaborative people. And they
Mm-hmm.
get that if they can coach, if they can be a mentor, then their people are going to succeed and achieve. And I think that people coming into the workforce have seen inklings and they see where it's successful. And
Mm-hmm.
and they see that they don't have to, right? There is a little bit of a freedom here.
Yeah.
It's, even in law firms, my son-in-law's a millennial, and when he started in a law firm, he had to work with a senior lawyer that just screamed at people and threw
Mm-hmm.
things, and it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And this person had a reputation, and fortunately, he got friendly with a lawyer who thought he did good work, and he went out on his own, and my son-in-law is being very successful. But he was people admired that he could put up with this, staple throwing guy.
Oh
Now,
my
it
gosh.
happened about 4 years after the staple throwing senior partner was asked to leave.
Mm.
So even though he was a partner, the law firm finally said this is unacceptable behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole culture changes. And that's where we start to talk about a positive workplace culture. And I saw something in the Harvard Business Review, and it talked about having too much emotional intelligence.
Okay. This I want to talk
I
about
was
this. Get
pissed
into this. Oh, okay. Yeah.
because you can't have too much or too little.
Mm.
You
Mm-hmm.
you are who you are. For example, I just met a lawyer who had very, very low impulse control. But you think about it, he's a lawyer. He's always trying to, get up.
Yeah.
I object. I object. On the other hand, he really had a high sense of empathy.
Hmm.
So when he worked with people or he was in a public situation, he really thought about what was going on. And his reflection was able to counterbalance that lack of impulse control.
Hmm.
So it really made him a stronger lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
He is who he is. And it's
Mm-hmm.
about balance. So it's, we were all overachievers. Did you try? Like, I would go into class, I'd go for those 2 points. 96, I want a 98. Well, in emotional intelligence, 94 to 100 is not an A. It's really more about balance.
Yeah.
What this person in the Harvard Business Review said is that this senior manager, basically their people walked all over them. She accepted all
Mm.
kinds of excuses. She did their work for them.
Mm-hmm.
She just was a doormat.
Mm-hmm.
They said, well, but see, she sympathized with them. She was a
Mm.
doormat.
Yeah.
When
That's not
you
emotional intelligence. Yeah.
Exactly. That's why it throws me off, because you don't have too much or too little.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you take those assessments and you make a decision if you're going to get coaching or you're going to work on something. On the other hand, you might find somebody to join your team.
Mm-hmm.
So I have, couldn't guess, medium level of medium level. I have a really strong level of reality testing. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what I need when I bring somebody on my team, I was a product manager. I don't want to lose that creativity,
Yeah.
but I always try to bring somebody like you on my team that will say, Susan, let's stop and think about this. And then you take a breath. But I know that because I'm aware of what my strengths and not so strong points are, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to make sure that I have Tess on my team to
Yeah.
just sort of slow me down.
So you said so many interesting things, but one thing that I keep coming back to is when you were talking about, I was saying, oh, you're being so diplomatic, but you're absolutely right that so much of this, it depends. And yeah, it's both parties. And I think this is why emotional intelligence and just working with people seems so scary to people, why people don't like it, why it feels, because there isn't a right answer. There's never a right answer. There's just the answer. And there's what you do and there's what you don't do. And I think that for many people, when you talked about that technical piece, right, of how we see things, there's always been, I think, this seeing the hard skills is better than soft skills, because there's a way to really quantify and show the data very clearly with hard skills versus soft skills, because it's a lot of like, people ask me these questions all the time, and it's a lot of like, well, it depends. It depends on the person, depends on the situation, depends on this, all of these things. So what I'm very curious about what you're seeing with, do you feel like companies are moving towards this place of understanding that good leaders need to have high EQ, that this is so valuable to that? Do you see that companies and organizations are understanding that a lot more?
I see, yes, the answer is yes. There still are companies out there that are sort of old school, and they focus on the technology, and they focus on being the sharpest crayon in the box and being the smartest. I think the most successful companies are the ones that are paying attention to the people. And what's really important, when I talk about paying attention, it's about mattering. There's been a lot of research by the American Psychiatric Association and some other industry leaders where people recognize that they are doing important work. I recognize I'm doing important work. And I know that it's valuable. However, I don't believe it until my manager tells me. And so if someone, I don't need somebody fawning over me and giving me a lollipop at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But if I feel recognized, even just, that was a great job, Susan. I don't need $100 bonuses. Money is always good, but give me recognition, just a little bit of recognition and appreciation. And what I find so sad is they discovered, if they were looking at professional people, was that about close to 85% of people felt like they were doing really good work. And they felt positive about what they were contributing. On the other hand, 37% of that same cohort did not feel that their management appreciated or found value in their work. And so they disengage.
Yeah.
Because if your opinion doesn't count, if nobody's they're going to ask you a question and then discount your answer.
Yeah.
Why? You just disengage.
Recognition is a huge piece. I mean, it's one of the core things that younger employees want and went into the workplace. And I love what you're saying, because the thing was that, I'm a Gen Xer. I wanted recognition. I wanted praise, but we never thought, I can only speak for myself. I never thought to ask for it. I never thought to go and ask for it or get that kind of feedback. I wouldn't even think about that. You just kind of wait to be told thank you or, oh, good job. And what I think is really interesting about the younger generations is that they very much came into work with this, wanting feedback, because they had lived their lives with feedback, from social media, from other places. But even millennials who didn't grow up with social media and all of this, they also wanted feedback, because parenting changed a lot, and the relationships with your kids changed. It became more of this, I feel like, this sort of movement of catching your kid doing well and being a more conscious parent, that people were used to, getting that kind of praise. And you're absolutely right that, there's that very famous Mad Men, clip you see everywhere where Don Draper's yelling at Peggy, like, it's the money, get the paycheck. But that, I think, illustrates very clearly that this was this idea of how things should be, right? The paycheck should be enough. And you wanting a thank you that's way too much to ask, to this place of, oh, okay, yeah, you know what? That does feel nice. I do want that. That feels good. And we all know, just like buying a new car or a raise, it gets old after a couple months. Do you know what I mean? It's not that exciting after, a month or two.
When you were talking, and I've had this conversation with you and other people a lot, I just realized something or thought.
Yeah.
If it could, part of gaining feedback is validating that you're doing the right work, as opposed to saying, I need you to tell me I'm doing a good job because everybody got a trophy on my soccer team.
Yeah.
Just when you were speaking, and I was thinking about, the nature of work has changed. It's much more individual, and not even talking about the pandemic, but when you're making code, you're writing code on your own.
Yeah.
Very often, especially when you're younger and it's a very task oriented, you're doing the work on your own. So I'm wondering if some of that need for validation comes from wanting to make sure they're doing the job right.
Yeah. No, very much so. Because that was something when I started working with millennials 15 some odd years ago, and that they all talked about wanting to make a big impact. I don't remember ever thinking that I wanted to make a big impact, but I did. I wanted to do something big and important and special and unique. Right. I wanted all of those things, but I never thought about it in that framework before. And so that's very, very interesting, because especially when you're starting out in your career, you are trying to figure out, am I in the right place? Am I moving in the right direction? Am I good at this? Do I enjoy this? And often we tend to default to, right, the more important question should be, do I enjoy this? Does this create meaning for me? But we tend to fall into the other category of, am I good at this? Do people like me? Do people want this from me? You need both, but it really needs to be about you. I want to go back to something that you said about the workplace changing and going from this type A to type B, because I think that's such a great way to think about it, which is that it's not necessarily, because I think that the media and what's been talked about is that young people, that these youngsters are coming in and they're entitled and they want this and they want that. But it sounds like because of their experiences, because the world has changed radically, technology and everything that's gone on, that we as a culture and a society, it's not the young people, they're just representing it. It's more of like, we've moved more to going from a type A to a type B mentality. Does that feel right?
I want to say yes. And again, as you're talking, I love talking with you because you're making my brain go. It's all about metrics.
Mm-hmm.
What are we measuring? So yes, I'm, are we, I really believe we're moving into more of a collaborative space. We've needed to do that because the work has become more of a brain trust. And just like you said, you're right. I was one of those people right out of college wanting to make a difference. And I was working with people who were bit heads and they didn't know how to help me learn how to make a difference. And so I'm wondering if somewhere along the line I think we're finally learning, but how do you measure that metric? How do you measure that metric? Because I've always been a collaborative manager and I've been transparent. And so I would get feedback from the people who reported to me. And I knew there were all these trainers that traveled like banshees. And I would try to take their message forward. And sometimes I could get what they wanted. And sometimes we didn't have the budget or we didn't have a structure. And I would go back and I'd say, well, thank you for your feedback. We can't do it right now. And I'd either say, I can't really explain that. I'm just letting you know I heard you. And, very soon I'll be able to explain that. And so but people thought I was a pushover. People
for having that follow-up.
For having that follow-up, for being transparent. I think the difference is the trainers that reported to me got the highest performance marks. So I like to think that had something to do with it. But I was judged by my peers as being too soft. And so today, I think more people from, you make one small change and another small change. And I think people are realizing that when you can be transparent and the people who work with you get a little bit more of the why, like Simon
Yes.
Sinek's why.
Yes.
And when you know why you're doing it and you have coaching to help you figure out how to do it with the what,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can be successful. I, you know, and I, but I think it's changing. And we
Yeah.
still have those people that watch all those Don Draper clips and still think that when you are a pie, you have to be demanding. You have to
Mm-hmm.
tell people.
Mm-hmm.
So the industry is changing, and you do need some guidance. It's not, you have guidelines. That's the other part about
Yeah.
delegating is, having those guidelines. But really, I think if you can help your manager be a better manager by asking questions when you
Mm-hmm.
don't understand if they're barking at you, and then ask that question. Say, Jim or Mary, I think I know what you're asking, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it. Could I walk through it?
Mm-hmm.
Or, um, and that if we ask, and that we give them an opportunity to correct, um, to change their frame, and they
Yeah.
might just realize that when I understand, I can come back, and I don't. They don't have to send me back 2 and 3 times
Yeah.
because I asked and they explained what they were at their expectations. I could bring it back right the first time.
Mm-hmm. Which is why younger employees, younger first time managers is a big one that I'm always saying need coaching, need that help. Because what you're talking about is you're new to the workplace, you're 22, 23 years old, your brain hasn't fully formed. And so exactly what you're talking about, that, understanding how to react to your boss, understanding how do I get clarity? How do I become more clear? How do we do this? And how do I do it with confidence? And, all of that isn't something that some people have it, but it's not innate. It really
You
isn't.
have to
And
practice.
you have to practice. Confidence is a muscle. So that's why coaching for young people in the workplace is so important. I think that a lot of times when they're looking at budgets and where they're going to spend money, it always goes to the CEO or the C-suites or this person or that person. But I do think that, this is my own theory, that companies would benefit
Oh,
tremendously if they spread the wealth a lot more and, gave everyone the opportunity
and
to grow and learn.
it's like I call it grassroots leadership
Yeah.
because no matter how amazing that vision is,
Mm-hmm.
if your your first line managers can't rephrase, if they can't communicate that vision to the worker bees, to
Mm-hmm.
our millennials and Gen Zers, then how are they going to execute on that vision?
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have what I like to call informal leaders. So if you have the official leader and they'll say, go do it. And you haven't a clue, but that's an opportunity for you to practice those team leadership roles.
Mm-hmm.
That's the time that you get to practice. And I don't know that companies recognize those team leadership roles as important
Hmm.
as they are. So if
Mm-hmm.
you have 3 people, how, and I think it's not a matter of being bossy or being a
Mm-hmm.
bully, but, when you have those 3 people, it gives you the opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to practice asking questions, practice saying, oh, I've got an idea.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you start to gain some of those leadership skills.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's you get there because everybody else stepped
Mm. Mm-hmm.
backwards.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which says something about you as well, right? That if you're not stepping backwards, that's sometimes you're voluntold, But in many ways, because your instinct wasn't to step backwards, you are probably the right person for the
Right. You
job.
were just going, you weren't smart enough to step backwards. Let's just put it that way. I wasn't smart enough to step backwards.
I'm too much of a rule follower to step back. You know what I mean?
Too.
So tell me, I want to hear, I want to hear about what you're up to and what you have going on in the future. But, since we are here to clean up the Gen mess, what do you think? Because it sounds like for you, it feels like, does it feel like putting people in these generational boxes?
I think it's awful.
You think it's awful?
Terrible.
Okay.
You can't put people in boxes.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm the end of the boomers.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked really, really hard. But, we had Kimberly and Amy that were the biggest screw ups. And they just were. And they were blonde and pretty and, came from a wealthy suburb. And they were very friendly with a couple of managers that were, the golden boys. And they just thought that, they would wander in around 9 and wait till the big cheese left and then zip out the door. So it looked like they were working late.
So for you, it sounds like it's really what people really need to be working on is more of the bias piece.
Exactly. And I think what would help the full span of generations, whether you've bought a lot of t-shirts, you're ready to retire, or you're just buying your first t-shirt and it's your first job, is to listen to other people and observe. So one of the ways that I say that emotional intelligence is an active verb, action verb, is because emotionally intelligent leaders observe the situation. They evaluate it based on what they see, their experience. That's taking that really deep breath, getting oxygen to your brain so that you can think more clearly. And if you take a second breath, everybody around you is going to take a breath because they're modeling that. And then when you've thought about it, you reflect it, you choose how you behave. And again, leadership is not a solo sport. You can't lead a team of one. And so collaborate is the fourth one, where you bring people together and you get the right people, not the people just like you, but the right people on the team to achieve that goal. And so that's, I like to think that emotional intelligence, as you mentioned, it's all about choice. And you aren't born with it. You develop it. In fact, your IQ is the highest at age 18. That's why we take
Really?
ATs.
Oh.
And it's not going to change. I think if you have a major brain injury, it might. But unless you have a major brain injury, it will never change.
Oh, I've never heard that stat before. That's so interesting.
And
that's so interesting.
Emotional intelligence, the psychometric, very deep scientific research went into the EQI assessment that I use. They will not, only under rare occasions will they use the assessment for people under 18. Because emotional intelligence develops as you gain experience and as you, I call it wisdom.
Yes.
More experience. And you kind of, because you make a mistake and you have to reflect and you go, okay, what will I do differently the next time? It's a learning thing. It's not we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
I still want to pull things back after I've said them to you, just like, can I pull it back? And so it takes practice. But if somebody says, Susan, I can't afford a coach, I don't have time, I want to do it now, the best thing to do is to pay attention. If you just stop and observe, listen, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason. Listen twice as much. And if you simply pay attention to what's going on, then that's the first step to recognizing how you're showing up to other people. What are the needs of other people? How can you communicate so your point gets across and you're able to bring those people together to achieve? I don't want
I
to say
love that.
it's not manipulating, but it's creating a situation, creating that positive work environment that people want to work with you.
Mm-hmm.
There's value in collaborating.
Yeah.
That
I wouldn't think of it as manipulative. Are there people that think that it's manipulative to listen, to pay attention, to notice and see what
that's
people
not the
want?
manipulative
Okay.
part. But if you're listening to learn what other people need and you
Ah,
can adapt
okay.
your behavior.
Yeah. But then I think it's about intention, right? What do you then do with that information? Are you going to hurt them or are you going to help them? Right? That's
Right.
the
Yep.
that's the big difference.
Right. And that's why both my books came, I wrote a book 8 years ago called Creating a Greater Whole, a guide to project managers becoming a leader. And it was because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So, like, if you have, I like to use my fingers, right?
Mm-hmm.
5 fingers, and I don't believe in fighting, but if you pull those 5 fingers together, they're a lot stronger. So, everybody on your project team is an incredible expert. But if they were each in their own expert silo, is your project going to get done?
Yeah.
Somebody has to have the glue to pull it all together.
Yeah.
And that's why one person can't do it alone. It's a matter of keeping that team. And coming out in April, I'm so excited.
Yes, that was my next question. So tell us, because I know you have a book coming out.
Well, it's an expansion on top of my other one. And we've taken the title and called it Creating an Even Greater Whole. Becoming an emotionally intelligent leader. Because it's taking that extra step and really focusing on emotional intelligence as that tool. When I wrote the first book, I approached emotional intelligence. It was still very much of a theory. I hadn't created that practicality. I hadn't made that jump into how can you make a difference. I hadn't made I just worked with a team. These two young women had never worked before, and they both had very low flexibility, but very, very high decision-making capabilities. But they were noted for being able to turn on a dime when somebody needed something done really fast. They worked for an organization that had needed uptime. Their product had to be 99% continuity. So if there was a problem, they had to fix it like that. And they came to these two young women, and what they realized when we were looking at it is they really like guidelines. They like process and procedures. And even though it ticks them off and they spend a few minutes complaining about here we go again, they are able, their reality testing and their decision making, they're able to take those procedures that they created and adapt them. They didn't have to go and recreate the wheel. So for their role, that bit of inflexibility is really, really good as they've created the foundation that they can turn on a dime when a crisis happens. They can fix it.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, so that's that practical aspect. And that's what I'm really hoping that this new book, Becoming an Emotionally Intelligent Leader, really brings to the front to let people know very simply some super simple tools and techniques that you can use to create that positive workforce that brings out the best in all of your team. And, I like to say, bring their best person to work.
Yes. Yes. But I love that. I love that suggestion and of just simply listening and paying attention mindfully and reflect. I think that a lot of times people hear that a lot, like, oh, I need to listen more. I need to do this more. But it's not just, you're not just listening. You're hearing. in a
Right.
way.
You're hearing, you're paying attention
yeah,
to
yeah,
what's going on in the whole situation. And a lot of times a bad situation happens because people are talking across each other.
yes.
And so when you're paying attention, I can say, Mark, I heard you say X, and I think Cindy is saying the same thing, but differently.
Mm-hmm.
Is this what you mean? Maybe take it in neutral words.
Yeah.
This is what Cindy means. And then all of a sudden, it's like the big mouth frog, right? They're like, oh, you mean we could do this together?
And yeah, and that's what I love about emotional intelligence is it's the magic sauce that if you actually did this kind of uncomfortable hard stuff first, it's gonna, because people want to go, and it feels like takes too long to, really dig in there. But it's like, no, you're going to pay for this on the other end at some point because of that. I love this whole idea of that we're moving from type A to type B. I think this is your next book because I think this is fascinating.
Right. And we didn't move like overnight.
Yeah. Oh,
So
no.
if you're
No, no, no.
trying to make a difference and you're trying to understand a difficult boss, you're not going to do it overnight.
Yes.
Choose little pieces, take one small step. And if you get pushback, then think about why did you get that pushback and what could you do to avoid that, to mitigate that risk in the future.
Yeah. So you have the book coming out April 6th.
The pre-order off Amazon is April 6th.
All right.
And then the April 25th, you'll get it in the mail.
And how else can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. You can't have too many friends, so find me on LinkedIn. And on my website, if you're interested, is riverbirchgroup.com. RIVER, B as in boy, IRCHGROUP.com. Thanks for asking.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for tuning in to the Gen Mess with Tess. Remember, we're fixing the mess one conversation at a time. Until next time, stay curious and don't let the Gen Mess mess with you.